Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real Conversations about Aging Parents. This is your host, Rebecca Tapia. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to go leave me a review on whatever platform you're listening. That will really help other people find the show. So today I am going to talk about the concept I've been kicking around in the back of my head called the minimum viable relationship. And what I mean by this is trying to put a framework or some content behind what is like the minimum ingredients for a successful relationship, specifically in a strained situation. So this came about because I have a close friend of mine who's struggling quite a bit with an aging parent. Through some reflection on her childhood and some of the things she's experienced, thinks that this person may have been a narcissist, relatively uncaring and challenging and difficult. And that has not changed as her mom, I think, is in her mid-80s at this point. And it's her mom's birthday this month, and she made the point to go travel out of state and visit with her mom. And I've been texting her, asking her how it's going, and she texted me back, holding the line. And I thought that was funny because, yeah, there's a lot that can go into this. And I couldn't find any really great statistics on the number of or the percentage maybe of strained relationships when you look at adult children and aging parents. But just in my own little experiment of people that I know and people that I've been working with, it's fairly high. So the thing I want to talk about today is I'm going to borrow from the business community. So the business community has a concept of something called a minimum viable product. And basically, if you're trying to take something to market or sell a product or service or something like that, you kind of have to define what is going to be minimally functional, not like it doesn't function, but just enough to deliver some value, just enough for you to test some assumptions about your product or service and function in a way to start learning. And so the idea is you don't want to spend, 7 years in research and development and then take something to market and find out the hard way that there were some major flaws from the beginning. The concept of a minimum viable product is finding just enough things that you feel like you can string together to produce some value, put it out there, see what happens, and then iterate from there. And that's kind of been much more popularized in the last 10 to 20 years versus getting it exactly right the first time. I even heard a story one time about a company that was trying to figure out the certain shape and size of a funnel for a washing machine somewhere in the inside of the washing machine. And they talked about a company that did tons and tons of research and development and spent a lot of time and money and then took it to market. And then another company that basically guessed, put it out to market, had it fail, went back, guessed again, and they were about 3 times faster at bringing the product to market and had a better product. And so anyway, the idea is the minimum viable product is like kind of a concept of an iterative type system where you guess at the minimum ingredients, try it, and if it fails, you try it again. And I say that because I think a lot of people get preoccupied with what a perfect relationship looks like, what the healthiest relationship looks like, what their friend's relationship with their parent may look like, or your imagined idea of what that relationship would have been or how it could have been better. And sometimes I feel like it's helpful to just reduce it back down to, what are the basic ingredients of a relationship that kind of meets your value system that you feel good about, but also takes into consideration limitations. And that could be boundaries. It could be limitations on your resources or time. And really, once you've kind of strung these ingredients together, the next step, the trick to all this would be, making sure that your brain can view this as enough, that you're doing enough or attributing enough resources based on whatever your decisions are. We're really focusing on something that's functional and not perfect and centered around connection. And that can be connection with that person. That could be connection with yourself, maybe interacting with that person, as with my friend, interfered with her connecting with herself. And at the end of the day, that this literally, what does enough look like is another way to think about it. And as opposed to kind of what we might ask ourselves in other situations in life, what does our maximum effort look like? Really, you're going back to like, what does enough look like? And so again, we're seeking a functional, although not perfect, way of connecting with somebody else. So let's go talk more specifically about what this could look like. Let's talk first about some of the strain points that would create the need for a minimum viable relationship. And that can be the strain just in the way that somebody communicates with you. That's probably one of the top reasons that a relationship is strained. And looking at, for my friend, one who is visiting a parent who has a strained, with whom they have a strained relationship. And then I have several other friends who are estranged from their parents because of communication. And a lot of that has to do with, at least going from my friend's point of view, feeling abused, feeling diminished after an interaction with an aging parent, feeling re-traumatized if there's things that came up. Like for one of my friends, it's always about body image. And her mom is always asking her, what is her latest effort to lose weight? What is she doing about her exercise routine? And, shouldn't she be thinking about doing some cosmetic work? And again, I mean, you can imagine that these are long-term issues. These are not issues that popped up later in life. These are long-standing components of that relationship where the mother is sort of looking at trying to curate their daughter's appearance in some way. And that is just, a theme. And so we always have kind of a little bet when my friend goes and speaks with her mother of how long there will be something that will be brought up about something about her appearance or her body in some way, which, of course, as you can imagine, maybe historically or generationally, that may have been an appropriate topic, but that is currently not an acceptable for most situations for the relationship to be defined by one person commenting and criticizing another person's appearance. But anyway, so the communication has a lot of different aspects, right? It's the content of the communication. So what are the types of things we talk about? And when you're looking at a minimum viable relationship, then there may need to be some guardrails on that, right? And maybe, we don't talk about, I don't want to go back and rehash issues with divorce or a financial problem or, I don't know, some other failing of somebody else in the family. Like maybe those topics just aren't productive or healthy. And it's okay in any relationship if it benefits, the health of the relationship and your mental health and your experience and your connection, to set boundaries and say, these are not things that I feel like are appropriate to talk about. And so the content itself, you can kind of think, if you came away with a pie chart on any given conversation, what percent was spent on what topics. And some of the complaints I'm sure you've heard in that podcast is increasingly, as older adults, if their lives are getting smaller and their worlds are getting smaller, then the content from which they can pick to talk to somebody else or connect with somebody else may be getting smaller and smaller. Ironically, though, I mean, they're also having more and more life experiences. So it's not that they don't have as much to talk about, but if the dominating theme of what you talked to your parent about for 30 years was your careers, maybe you're both attorneys or you're both working in business or whatever, and then that person is no longer working in that, maybe they have some advice, but if it's all based on sharing real-time information, that can be really challenging. So the other thing with communication, content, I think, is probably one of the biggest flashpoints. It's just what kind of things are talked about. I'm sure you could think about politics or religion or any number of controversial areas where that could be challenging to talk to a parent about, especially if people have grown apart or changed over time. But yeah, so think of content as sort of the coloring of that particular connection. Like what kind of makes up the things that get transferred back and forth? Are they healthy? Do they feel productive? Do they feel traumatic? Do they feel like you can walk away? And I feel like, if I'm trying to create connection with somebody, even neutral is probably okay with me. I certainly don't want to walk away less of a focused and healthy person than when I walked into that conversation. That's probably not a great interaction. So another component of communication beyond the content is the frequency. And so I know there are some people that have a defined frequency. So my friend that has this strained relationship with her mom says, I'll see my mom about every 2 years. And at one point, it was kind of a bilateral decision because the mom could travel here and she could travel to, out of state to see her mom. But with her mom aging and having some other impairments, the ability for her mom to travel has diminished quite a bit. In fact, the last time the mom was here, part of that was announcing that this was the last time she was ever going to visit. And so, yeah, it's been a while. And so my friend is visiting her mom. And I really challenged her on this because she does have a lot of struggle each time she's interacted with her mom. And I feel like it's just so much baggage and so much history there, and so much gets dusted up. And it appeared to me, again, as a friend, it just sounds like a very unilateral relationship where, my friend sort of is the audience, and the aging parent is the professor. And that's just kind of how the whole visit goes. There really isn't a lot of interest or engagement in like what's going on in my friend's life. It's a lot about just, holding court, I guess. But anyway, that's just my perception as a peripheral friend. But that said, the frequency is something to reconcile with, one, your availability, right? The frequency can depend on quite a few things, right? So one of it is just proximity. Like if you live next to your mom or, aging parent or whatever, I mean, I'm assuming that part of the reason that has come about is to increase the frequency of that communication or that connection. And so that can be texting connections. You can say verbal connections. It could be talking, or it can be in person. And so, going back to this relationship with my friend's mom, she refuses to text. And I understand there are some limitations to that, but the way that she's talked about texting, not because there's a cognitive or motor impairment to it, is she just prefers people to call her. And so a lot of relationships have suffered from that, because especially relationships with their grandchildren, because, most people under 25 are preferring to text and share photos and information online or through text messages. And she's just kind of drawn this line in the sand that if somebody wants to connect with her, it will be by phone and by phone only, and not even through the cell phone, because the cell phone isn't turned on. It would have to be somebody calling her residence, and then, she would need to be available for that. And so, but she's taken a stand, because I've seen some in communications about this topic, that she is going to make it mean if somebody does not reach out to her by phone that they do not want to be in contact with her. And of course, you could flip that over and say, if you're not going to participate in messaging, even though you do use a computer and email and all the other things, then maybe you don't want to be in contact with your grandkids, but we'll just leave that aside for now. So, but that said, the frequency of communication is also, looking at the mode, right? So what are other ways that you get in contact with people? Maybe not so much snail mail, but back in the day, yes, right? And like I said, texting, phone, in person, etc. And so I think a lot of people, when they have a strained relationship, just say, I'm going to see my parent twice a year. I'll go at Thanksgiving and at Easter or whatever. Like, you just have some set frequency, and you kind of just decided that is the minimum viable relationship frequency. So now over time, that frequency may decrease, and you may think, man, every time I go there, I come back like a worse human being. And so maybe it used to be 3 times a year, and now it's once a year. Or maybe you say, man, every time I go there, things seem to be changing. I really want to connect with that person. I'm really worried about how fast things are changing with their health. I'm going to up that to the best I can, 5 or 6 times a year, whatever that's going to be. And so I'm not saying that once you lock into a certain frequency that's it. The idea would be, at this moment, the healthiest version of this relationship that you can tolerate, what is that frequency looking like? The other thing, so that's based on like communication, the content of the communication, frequency, maybe even the context. Like, are these always in the context of big celebrations where there's a lot of people there, or in the context of a more intimate, like, I'm coming to see you, and that's all we're going to do. And I think for a lot of people, that is a consideration for what a minimum viable relationship is, because maybe they're able to tolerate that parent, or the parent behaves differently when there's a large number of people around. Like, the chances that somebody's going to fat shame you or job shame you or money shame you in front of 60 people, hopefully that is less likely than if you're in a room having a one-on-one conversation. Or maybe you just have one of those completely flagrant personality disorders where they're like, that's the best time to go ahead and shame their kids in front of everybody else. So anyway, and so I have heard of a lot of relationships kind of subsisting on being there in large groups. So you could recruit siblings. So my friend who's visiting her mom right now, the whole reason she's there is she was going to go see her brother, and then they kind of built in this trip to go see the mom, who I think lives maybe an hour away or something. And so she's going in a team. So her and her brother had to pregame this whole interaction and kind of lay out what the boundaries were going to be, how long they were going to stay there, and what the content of the activities was going to be, and then the exit strategy, I guess, if you will. And so, yeah, so and this is what she thought about. This is what I think could be successful. It's very time limited. There's going to be other people there, and we are going to limit the topics if she goes into, things that are non-productive and unhealthy to discuss. So anyway, so that's communication. The next thing to think about, we talked about sort of the actual communication and the connection part, but I think maybe even beyond that, if we just zoomed out a 30,000-foot view, is what's the goal of the relationship? And I really think that's a really important question. Maybe that deserves its own podcast. But I think if you're not sure what the goal is, like if you go to the grocery store and you're not really sure what you're there for, like if you're going to make a meal or buy, items for the week, then you can kind of get lost or buy things you don't need or not buy the things you do need, right? And so the idea is like, what's the actual goal of the relationship? And I think, maybe you went into this 10 years ago thinking, I'm going to be the best A+ perfect daughter, or I'm going to have the healthiest, best relationship with my dad, or I'm going to, max this relationship out like I do everything else in my life. And the idea is, what if the goal isn't to create conditions that never existed before? Like if you weren't close to that parent as a child or in your young adulthood, maybe there is a viable pathway to become close. Maybe there's a new bonding experience or a new shared experience, something like that. But if that's not the overt goal, is to create a closeness or intimacy that never existed before, what if the goal is just a workable respect for each other and their roles without trying to dress this up and make this either a psychologically safe situation when it never was, or make that person perform in a way that's not possible for them? And so one of the biggest evolutions in working with my friend through this issue with her mom has been her going from, why can't my mom just follow these basic, behavioral things? Like, why can't she just respect my boundaries or care about how I'm doing or ask about how I'm doing or, be interested in my children's lives? And anyways, we go through and we've changed the language, and it says, instead of saying, why won't she? And then we've altered it to say, why are we expecting her to do more than she can or ever has before? And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, like, oh, she's just not capable. But man, it solves a lot of problems when you've seen the same thing happen for decades and decades or your entire life. And the next solution, like if part A, if choice A in the multiple choice was, why is this person, never respected me? Then maybe choice B in the multiple choice is, this person is not capable of that. And what happens to your brain when you shift to, they're not capable, then you resume some control over that situation. Because once you realize that they're not capable of that, then one, you can let go of the drama of why they don't. Because when you go down to why won't they do it this way or treat me this way or whatever, or why did they do it this way in a way that hurt me, then that's a whole other thing to figure out. Do they love me? Do they even love themselves? What happened in their childhood? And maybe you could explore that like with a therapist. But from a pragmatic standpoint, when your brain starts to operate with like, oh, they can't, and nor should I expect them to go above and beyond, especially once you've given feedback or set some goals or expectations or boundaries, and they're still not able to, work within those. And then now the idea is, why are we expecting more out of this interaction? Why are we, what? And then you can look inwards and say, oh, okay, I got it. Okay. This is something I can control. I gotcha. Okay. And so the idea is that when you're working towards, defining or working towards this relationship, not having unrealistic expectations, not putting a bunch of guilt on them or yourself. What if I just said, look, they're not capable of getting in and out of a car, so you can't go to dinner? And you'd be like, oh, okay, that makes total sense. We'll just order takeout, right? But if I say they're not capable of treating you in a way that makes you feel loved or respected, okay, there's a lot of gravity to that statement, right? And there's a lot that goes into that and a lot to process. But at the end of the day, it's still a capability issue. They're just not capable of producing that relationship or participating in a relationship like that. And so watching her iterate over time, like I said, with the business people, let me try this. The most recent iteration is I'm going to go meet with my brother. We're going to drive to see my mom. It's going to be time limited and I'm going to come home and to go see my therapist and move on with my life. And so we talked about communication. We talked about connection. We've talked about respect in the relationship and working towards a workable respect in both directions. And that is going to involve boundaries. It's going to involve maybe modulating the frequency or exposure in a way that you're working towards, a respectful relationship that's respectful to you and honors your value system and respectful to the other person, even if you don't like them, right? Or even if they're horrible to you. But however you end up showing up in the world, that you just want to respect their role in your life, maybe respect their age or their impairments in a way, whatever that looks like. And of course, there are always options and there are always situations that maybe none of us will ever be a part of, hopefully, where sometimes that all leads you to there is no minimum viable relationship with this person. And you've iterated and you've tried and you've modulated all these things and you've tried to set boundaries and you tried to do the frequency and you tried this and you tried that. And I have a handful of friends that this has led to a literal estrangement. Like that is the next step. They're like, I don't have a way that it's workable. It's no longer workable, right? That's just the way that the relationship has gone. So I'm not saying that that's like the definite end of all of this, right? And maybe I think a lot of people just end up iterating, through that lifetime, through the end of that natural life, and you've done the best you can. And I think there should be some relief in that. That, you've tried to define the minimum viable relationship and maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. And even in positive, healthy relationships, that changes over time, right? I mean, there's a lot of factors to that. So let me take some features of a minimally viable product from the business world and let's think about them in terms of this relationship. So one of the core features of a minimum viable product is that it's iterated on gradually and with feedback. And so that relationship can be iterated on gradually over time, not like you have to get it perfect. And with feedback, but not just feedback from the aging parent, right? Like, oh, I didn't like that you didn't call me last month or whatever. It's feedback from yourself, from your spouse, from your children, from other people that might depend on your presence in their life, and integrating that feedback just like you do in anything else, just like you do at work, right? The next feature of a minimum viable product is it doesn't try to be perfect, but just functional. Because the attempt to be perfect kind of has an excessive use of resources and a low feedback system. This attempt to be perfect because of how you envision the relationship should or could be kind of makes you blinded to the real feedback in the real world. And the real feedback points would be, how do I feel after this interaction? And maybe you're like, man, I'm being extra sensitive here. I need to dial that back. Or I'm not being sensitive at all. And I just got, totally verbally abused and I didn't even realize it. I mean, you're going to have to kind of turn those dials back and forth. But going back to this idea that we're looking for a functional, viable relationship and not the perfect relationship. The next thing it does is it can always grow later if successful. And when it finds success, kind of like a river trying to find new channels for the water, it's kind of going here and then turning left and then turning right. And then it can actually improve. And I've seen a lot of, I've been kind of negative talking about some instances on this podcast of negative interactions, but I have also seen the opposite happen where the relationship greatly improves later in life. I've seen the aging parent kind of chill out sometimes and just, become a different version of themselves for a variety of reasons and finally allow some connection or allow even maybe some reconciliation, of things that went really well or things that went poorly and really kind of reflecting on that. And so, going back to, what problem are we trying to solve? Like, what was the product trying to solve? And I really think when we look at the minimum viable relationship, we're trying to define success where it's otherwise vague in a highly emotional, huge, risk for baggage relationship that's time limited. I mean, we're all time limited, right? But the relationship is literally time limited because of just, the natural course of life. I mean, people's lives end. And so we're looking at, what are we doing with the time we have left? And, really trying to bring into the problem we're trying to solve is just, optimizing our connection with ourselves and others throughout our lifetime. I mean, even the idea of going to work is, connecting with some sort of product or service. So you might have an income so you can fund the things that are important to you in your life and function. And so, going back to this kind of just walking through life and this journey of trying to find healthy and productive connections. And I really think the whole point of this podcast is to just take that second step and be mindful of, what are the components of it and how am I iterating on it? And of course, this can be applied to your marriage, to your relationship with your kids, your relationship with your career, whatever it is. But in the context of an aging parent, I think it becomes even more important because perhaps we are in a more time-limited situation. A parent might be well beyond their life expectancy, like 85 years old, right? And so really focusing on, what does that mean as far as communication and frequency, connection, content of the communication, visits, all that kind of stuff. And then once you decide and once you're, on that iterative pathway, the next trick is really to convince yourself or allow yourself to understand that that is the best you can do. That is the most that you are going to be able to do at this time. And iterating itself is an act, I think, of commitment, an act of love, like it's a very outward demonstration that somebody's trying. And I'm sure you've heard that before. You're right. Like, I don't mind if they're imperfect. I just mind that they're trying. And I think that helps. And I can come away from some failed things in my life and think, yeah, but I tried, here's all the different things I tried. It didn't work out. But here's all the things that I took seriously and I did try in earnest to make this productive. And that's a different scenario than, hey, I didn't even try, didn't even, give a second thought. So anyway, I know that was kind of a meandering podcast. I appreciate you listening. Please, please, please leave me a review on any of the platforms you're on, and I will talk to you soon. Have a great week. Hey everyone, it's Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to take just a moment to review the disclaimer. This podcast is for informational and occasional entertainment purposes only. Nothing discussed here is formal medical, legal, or financial advice. By listening to the podcast, we are not creating a patient-doctor relationship between you and myself or any of the guests. Really, it's just me and a possible guest or two, sometimes three, sitting around talking about difficult topics related to aging parents. If you have or suspect that you might have a medical problem or condition, you should seek advice from a licensed medical professional. If you have any questions or concerns, please read the full disclaimer in the show notes or contact me directly. Thank you again for joining us today. I can't wait to see you next week. Have a good day.